What is craft to me? It's that age-old argument, craft versus art, or rather art versus craft. To me, craft is art that is handmade, usually using traditional tools, and that's not accurate either, because in today's world we use completely different technologies, or we can. But craft is art just of a different sort. Craft is born out of function, blurs the line between function and non-function sometimes, and today more and more. I guess it's art with a function. I make things because I have to. It's who I am. It defines me. It's hard to say whether my work is unique or not. I wouldn't call it unique. In the early days in Edmonton, yes, indeed it was. I don't think people even knew anything about handmade objects. Jewelry, yes, because there have always been some studio jewelers here in town, but they all worked in gold because silver didn't bring them the return on their dollar, which I understand. So in the beginning, yes, I was very unusual here, and the work was unique because it didn't look like antiques, which is what people had here, and it's what is sold in most of the stores. If you go to Burke's and look at a silver tea service, it might just as well have been done in the 1850s as today, and it was made just yesterday. So modern pieces, that in the early days made me unique. But of course today, with the flourishing of the crafts, and I mean all of the crafts, there are a lot of very, very good silversmiths in Canada now. When I did come to Canada back in 1967, I described myself as Canada's other silversmith because at that time Lois Bettridge was very well known. I had heard of her. Of course, there were a few others, but I hadn't heard of them yet. Of course, when I started, I had very few tools, a saw, some pliers, one hammer, one stake to hammer against, and very little money for materials. So what I did was what I could on that scale. But over time, gifts from my parents every Christmas and birthday of more tools and more equipment, I was able to carry on in much more depth. And finally, I decided that I needed to have people around me who shared my interest. So I started teaching, which turned out to be really very good. There were many reasons for teaching. One was to get a group around me that we could talk about the same things. And the other was to foster an interest in handmade silver. Because when we first came to Edmonton, nobody was doing what I was doing and what I wanted to do more of. So it worked very well, and I taught probably 6 classes a week from my studio, both during the day and in the evenings. But now, of course, as I'm older and more jealous of my time, I have just 1 day a week, which is really basically open studio because it's with the people who have been with me for a very long time. There was nobody here when we first came. I really worked in a vacuum, but our children were small, and I couldn't focus on a career as such. I just made the things that I wanted to make, sold small pieces as I had when I was going to university. We called it hippie jewelry in those days. But it kept us, my husband and me, in groceries towards the end of the month when his teaching assistantship ran out. So it took a long time before there was any reaction to what I was doing. There was no place to sell my work. except finally the Edmonton Art Gallery had a nice gift shop. And I did very well there when Brenda Banks was running the gift shop. But that's one of the reasons why I'm really glad for the Alberta Craft Council, because craftspeople here need somewhere to show their work and to sell their work. And the Bay doesn't want it, Berks doesn't want it. You see what we're up against. I am consignor number 1, yes, at the Craft Council. That's probably because I was partly instrumental in the Craft Council starting, mainly because we needed a place to show and sell fine craft. When I was very young, I was actually 10, sorry. The town I grew up in, Lincoln, Massachusetts, was given a building provided it was used as a museum. Well, it's a small community outside of Boston. It was a farming community. And in order to make this work, they started giving classes in the arts and the crafts. And going down the list of what was available, I had done pottery. We did that at school. I had done painting. We did that at home and at school. I had done, I wasn't that interested in weaving. But when it came to metalwork and jewelry, I was fascinated. I didn't know you could do that by hand. I was a typical youngster who just thought you go to stores and buy that stuff. So you had to be 12 before you could take this class, so I had to wait a few years impatiently. I think I took a drawing course or a painting class, but I started when I was 12 at Saturday morning children's classes. And it was wonderful. I just loved it from the beginning. When I was growing up, I grew up in a very artistic family. My mother had been an art librarian at a university. My dad taught architecture and city planning at MIT. And architecture and art were a big part of our growing up. My father went on a watercolor trip every summer for his vacation from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And when we children were old enough to go with them and not embarrass them at a dinner table, we went along too, and we were watercoloring as well. So this was a big part of our lives. As for the silver, as I said, it was just that I didn't realize you could do that. And once I started sawing and hammering and moving the metal around, it just seemed wonderful to me. And it still does. It still has that magic. I think the wonderful thing that I find about silver is that it's cooperative. If you know how to tell it what to do, it does what you ask. It's very malleable. You can hammer it in many directions. You can stretch it. You can compound it, forge it so that it's thicker, as well as thinning it down. It just can do so many things without very much effort on my part, as long as I know how to ask. With the right hammer, with the right technique, with the right tools, and long experience in moving the metal. And it took me a long time before I realized what control I could have and then what control I do have. And now it's like athletes speak about the sweet spot. It's no longer the magic, but it is the magic. I don't even think about it. It's just an extension of my arm. And of course, my arm is an extension of my brain. So you really become very much one with the material. I think the hardest part of what I do in my life is finding enough time. When the children were young and not in school yet, we have 3 children, it was very difficult to find time to do any work at all, although I did. I was always thinking also. You know, when you're washing a dish and you think, boy, this is an impractical thing to have to wash. How would I design it and make it better? Or pouring something out of a pitcher that doesn't pour without dribbling, and you get angry. When the children finally got into school, it was wonderful. The minute they left the door, it didn't matter whether the beds were made, the breakfast dishes were washed. That was my time. And I would work in my studio until they came home for lunch. And we'd have a lovely lunch together, and then I'd send them off again, and it was my time until they came home from school. And of course, I had to go to bed earlier in those days, and I would go back to work because my husband often had evening classes, and I was able to work long into the night. In fact, our kids tease me now about not being able to get to sleep unless they hear hammering. I was so glad when the Craft Council really got established, because it put us on the road to having a shop where we could show our work and sell it, and show it especially to the people of Alberta. I was looking very much forward to hoping to be able to have exhibitions that could travel well outside of Alberta, because as far as I'm concerned, Alberta is a hidden gem. Nobody knows what goes on here. And I think it's important to showcase what can be done here and what is being done here. So it's very important to belong to an organization like this, also for the camaraderie and the friendships that we've forged together. I come from the Boston area, as I've said, and that is a very old area, and they have a very well-established craft council, although it's called the Society of Arts and Crafts, one of the first in the US. So I was dismayed that there was no such organization here. And a group of us, as I recall, went to Calgary, Ian Medland and I, there was one other person, but I don't remember who that was. We drove down to Calgary because we had heard that there was some sort of meeting going on, rabble-rousing, to get an organization going. And I just remember being very disappointed that, first of all, we weren't taken very seriously because there was a big rivalry, which still exists, I think, to some degree, between Calgary and Edmonton on all fronts. But then shortly after that, there were some meetings in discontinued school here in Edmonton. And that was in the beginning of the founding of a lot of arts organizations. It was related to the 75th anniversary of Alberta, and the government, which had money in those days, put aside $75 million to support arts and sports organizations. And from there, the next step I remember was being involved in sort of an umbrella organization that was only in active for 3 years or so, that brought together smaller organizations that couldn't afford to have administrative positions. And that was called ARC, Alberta Arts Recreational, I forget exactly what. I think I have it written down. And Donna Cardinal was the executive director of that. And she was wonderful. She actually got us all offices in the McLeod building for a 5-year lease for $1. And it was wonderful to have a real office. We were able to get an office manager who was sort of a secretary who took care of anything that we needed. And that was the first step. We did not have a shop yet, but from there it grew. There have been many times with the Craft Council that I have felt really good about being represented here. In the early days, started having special mini shows for government gifters, people in the government who were in charge of purchasing gifts for visiting dignitaries or diplomats. And I think a lot of us profited by that very much. I started making an Alberta bookmark, which was very easy to travel. You could take a whole pack of them with you and hand them out at conferences or meetings abroad. Also, for 2 years running, a group of us, the more senior artists, were taken to the Navy Pier Show in Chicago, which was a real coup to secure space at that exhibition. It's recognized internationally. And our first foray there, it was said that we wouldn't do it unless we could do it for 2 years. The first foray, of course, we didn't know what to expect, really. I don't know whether anybody had ever been to it, and we weren't terribly successful. But the second year, all of the stock, of course, was changed, and I know I sold out. I think most people did. Most people did. So that was wonderful. That's the kind of outreach that I would like to see more of. But of course, that costs a lot of money, and we are working very hard to secure funding for that kind of thing. As to the future for the Craft Council, I would love to see a specific purpose designed and built space that is wheelchair accessible, which we are not yet. And it's large enough to have a large gallery space, perhaps some studios that you could rent time in, because it's especially woodworking and metalsmithing. The equipment is quite expensive and takes up a lot of space, and not everybody can have this in a home studio or a rented studio space. And a library. I would love to see a library here. For selfish reasons, I have probably the best metals library in Western Canada, and I'm 81 now, or almost 81, and what do I do with it? I would give it to the Craft Council. And I know people don't use books that much anymore, but there's a wealth of information and reproductions that you probably won't be finding on the internet. When I left high school, I announced to my parents that I was not going to go to university. I was going to go to art school. But both of them, being good academics, said, well, dear, we'll find you a university with a good art department that offers metalsmithing. Now, in those days, there were maybe 3 of them that were accredited enough to please my parents. And one of them was in New England, and 2 in the Midwest of the US. Well, we had a rule in our family that you had to go to school outside New England so that you'd learn and understand how different people think differently elsewhere. And I thought it was nonsense, but I'm really very glad about it, because I did go to the University of Iowa in Iowa City, which was considered at the time probably the best graduate school in fine arts. The graduate school was larger than the undergraduate departments. And it was exciting, of course, a big state university with a football team and all the rah-rah stuff that goes with that I had never experienced. And the silver class was held in a tin temporary building, post-war temporary building, and was really very rustic, quite dirty, but wonderful to have all that space. Unfortunately, the professor was an alcoholic, and when he found that he had a student who knew a little bit about what was going on in metals, he started attending less and less. And I ended up standing in for him quite a bit of the time. Now, that was disappointing to me, of course, but there were a couple of other students and a graduate student who had been there a long time. So we learned from each other, because I had had a much deeper training in silversmithing. He had a goldsmithing experience. But when I moved on to get my master's, I was teaching quite a bit of the time. They couldn't give me a salary because it didn't exist for that. position, but they did give me academic credit all along the way. I think what I benefited most, though, from the University of Iowa were my BA and master's degrees in fine arts, because the requirements in those days were much broader than they are now. As a master's studio degree, you had to take all of the art histories, write the same papers, do the thesis that the art historians had to do. So your education was much more complete. Architecture, of course, has been a large part of who I am and influences my work, certainly. Having grown up in a family of architects, not just my father, but several relatives, and eventually my sister, and eventually our daughter, I think what it's given me mostly is a sense of structure. I need to have my pieces. They may be playful, they may be silly, some of them, but they have to have a certain grounding. It makes me nervous if something looks like it's not stable. So I think that's probably where architecture shows up mostly in my work. During my teenage years and well into my 20s, and even after we were married, I was a summer babysitter for a family of 5 boys on an island off the coast of Maine. And that island had been a granite quarrying island, and in fact supplied the vast columns at St. John the Divine in New York City. And of course there are abandoned quarries everywhere, full of water, wonderful swimming holes, bottomless practically. And eventually my husband and I bought an abandoned quarry, the most recently abandoned one. And it's a wonderful source of granite to use, either in jewelry or for bases of bowls, or some of my pieces I use a rough piece for the handle for a pitcher or a goblet. It's interesting, we had a Zoom visit to this exhibition, the current exhibition, and my brother pointed out that he thought some of these wall pieces, the copper wall pieces, harkened back to the granite quarries, and it hadn't occurred to me when I was making them. I viewed them more as still lifes or cityscapes, and he saw them as the big stacked blocks of granite that are strewn all over Vinyl Haven Island. I've been inspired by a lot of artists, most of whom I don't know the names, because I would come across images in books and not do much follow-up, because in those days I was not interested in the work the way I am now. However, of course, George Jensen, back in my early days, was the one that was the best known, and his work is so simple and clean, with some decoration, but the decoration made sense. And of course, he had a large stable of artists, and the Danish silversmiths became better and better known. Koppel is one that I truly admired. And then when I came to Canada, I found that there was quite a few besides Lois Bettridge. Don Stewart is one. He taught at Georgian College until just recently. Cynthia Ide from the Boston area, and Betty Longy, and there are a number of them now, and I've been lucky enough that I've met many of these people at a conference that I go to annually. It's called SNAG, the Society of North American Goldsmiths, and it's a wonderful group. They're very generous with their time and expertise. We've developed good friendships. I'm always asked, how do you think of these things? How do you design these? And if I'm not making a full volume, a typical bowl or vessel of that sort, It's always fun to fold paper. And folding paper, you can easily change it, adjust it, start over again, which is rather difficult and foolish to do in the silver itself, or even in copper. But paper is wonderful, and many of the pieces that I really like have been made first in paper. I've always thought that functioning objects needed to function well. And I still feel that way, because if you're using a tool, which is an object, if the hammerhead is uneven, or if the handle's too long or too short, you're aware of that. You want it to be just right. If you're pouring out of a teapot, you don't want to be burning your hand because the handle of the teapot is too close to the body of the teapot. Whether it's even in a ceramic teapot, it can be uncomfortable. So yes, I think functioning objects is extremely important. However, for this exhibition, I made a small pitcher it looks dandy. I think it's spectacular, but the handle is very smooth and far distant from the weight of the body of the piece. So if you pick it up, be sure you have your hand under the front or it will slide down. I had thought it might come up, but it hasn't, about how in the early days there was not much written about how to make things. When I first started, there was what was considered the Bible by Herbert Marion, and I think it was published first earlier than my copy, which is 1959, and it was the only book that described, or that was available to us, that described how to work in silver. He was British, so it was geared in that direction. And then in the 60s, Herbert Morton wrote a book which we all immediately gobbled up. My copy is well worn and falling apart. Then there was von Neumann, and then Appie Untrack, and finally Tim McCreight and others. And I thank Tim McCreight for writing his book. His first copy was actually hand-lettered and with hand-made, hand-done drawings. And when I first met him at SNAG, I said, "Thank you for writing that. That means I don't have to," because I had started a book myself, just like that, with my drawn illustrations. Now, of course, you can find out lots of things on the internet, some of it not very good advice. However, there are a lot of wonderful books available now.